Let me introduce someone to you. This is Paper Cat. He draws his facial expressions with a pen. He doesn't like rainy days because paper gets wet. He doesn't like being touched because it leaves creases. He doesn't eat vegetables. He loves lying on the pages of books. He scratches the curtains drawn inside his notebook. And because his eyes are flat, judging distance is difficult for him. I'll stop there for a moment. Chances are you've already decided what Paper Cat really is. Hold on to that thought because that act of interpretation is exactly what I'm going to talk about. I Don't Want to Become Human, Meow is an autobiographical fiction about a paper cat who receives an autism diagnosis and gradually finds himself caught between these two identities. Although the story is fictional, the epistemic experience I'm going to discuss is real. To understand this experience, we first need to talk about a concept called epistemic injustice. The philosopher Miranda Fricker introduced the term epistemic injustice to describe situations in which people are treated unfairly as knowers. In autism research, this idea has become increasingly influential. Research has shown that autistic people are experiencing injustice in the production of knowledge, whose experiences are believed, whose interpretations are accepted, and whose ways of understanding autism are considered legitimate. One form is testimonial injustice. Here, prejudice makes someone's words seem less credible than they deserve. An autistic person may be ignored before they even begin speaking, or assumed to be unreliable just because they are autistic. Another form is hermeneutical injustice. This happens when people lack the concepts or language needed to understand an experience. Autistic people often find it difficult to understand themselves outside stigmas and deficit-based language. Now, let's go back to Paper Cat. One day, Paper Cat comes back from the hospital with a new word for himself: autism spectrum disorder. He is not entirely sure what spectrum means yet, but he starts learning. He joined a neurodiversity group chat and saw someone sharing information about ARFID. He was happy, because for a long time, he had known that something about eating was difficult for him. Now this difficulty had a name. He sent the article to his family group chat, and his mother replied, "We lacked awareness back then." Well, this sounds like the beginning of a familiar story, the story that often happens to autistic people after receiving a diagnosis. They finally get a name for what has been happening to them. They start looking back at their life, and suddenly many confusing things begin to connect. A difficulty that looks like laziness, weakness, or bad behavior can be understood as something real and not their fault. They are not weird or broken anymore. Instead, they are autistic. Diagnosis gives them new interpretive resources, and this is very important. But diagnosis does not only give you one story. It places you inside a world full of competing stories about autism. Some of those can be harmful. For some newly diagnosed autistic people, this creates another kind of difficulty. They may be treated differently because of the new label. They may internalize deficit-based narratives and begin to understand their traits as symptoms, limitations, or failures. This is one important way epistemic injustice can appear during identity reconstruction. But Paper Cat's story is not mainly that story. Paper Cat mostly encounters affirming neurodiversity narratives. He learns about autism through community, group chats, and research. So why does he still struggle? This is where the story becomes more complicated, because diagnosis was not really the beginning of his story. Before autism entered the picture, Paper Cat already had a way of understanding himself. He was not an empty page waiting for a diagnosis to write meaning onto him. He was already a paper cat. The word ARFID brings back an old memory. When Paper Cat was a child, there was one thing he absolutely could not eat: tomatoes. Tomatoes were terrifying. They were wet, soft, uneven, and full of juice. Paper Cat said, "Cats don't eat tomatoes. Tomatoes are scary, meow." But his parents just said, "Don't be ridiculous." At the time, no one treated this as a valid explanation. It was too childish, too unreasonable. There is no way it could be taken seriously. But when the exact same difficulty is explained as ARFID, it suddenly becomes easier to accept. It belongs to a recognized clinical vocabulary and can be sent to a family group chat as an article. It sounds legitimate. But is Papercat's earlier explanation really meaningless? You see, diagnosis does not arrive in an empty space. It can arrive after years of private explanations, personal myths, metaphors, survival strategies, and stories that may never have been recognized by anyone else. Now I am autistic. What happens to my old explanations? What happens to my old identity? With the tomato, the problem is recognition from others. But sometimes, even when no one is directly rejecting your own explanation, you may start doubting it yourself. Because some explanations feel more scientific and more correct. Papercat is beginning to doubt whether his own story was ever really true. Now I know why I don't like rain. It's because I have sensory processing differences. Don't you always know? It's because you're made of paper and you'll get soaked. But that isn't the real reason. So by this point, Papercat has already started to feel the pressure of a more authoritative language, but near the end of the story, he tried to push back and tries to reclaim his own story. Let's see how it goes. One day at a McDonald's, Papercat tries to talk to his partner. I'm actually a paper cat. You are not a paper cat. Real cats meow, walk on all fours, and eat paper mice. You don't. Why should I meet your standards? No matter what you say, I am a paper cat. Fine, you are a paper cat, I admit it. You think you are a paper cat because you are autistic. Now, here I want to introduce one more concept, contributory hermeneutical injustice. This happens when someone refuses to engage with another person's own framework and instead translate that person's experience back into a more dominant framework. For example, an autistic person's own experience of their special interest may be treated as less valid than an outsider's interpretation of what a special interest should look like. Papercat is trying to use his own language to explain himself, but his partner rejects that language by turning it into a test. He gets to decide what Papercat has to do in order to be recognized as a real cat. Papercat's experience is not treated as knowledge. Instead, it becomes materials for someone else to test and evaluate. And when Papercat refuses the test, his partner absorbs even that refusal into autism. You think you are a cat because you are autistic. If Papercat says he is a paper cat, that becomes autism. If he refuses recognition, that also becomes autism. And if he says his knowledge does not need to be reasonable, even that can be explained as autism. Like, there is no way out. So most of the time when we talk about what makes autistic identity reconstruction difficult, we focus on deficit-based narratives. And of course, those narratives are so harmful. But Papercat's story also points to a different problem. Can empowering narratives become too powerful? Not because it is wrong, but because it explains so much. Once autism becomes a main story, everything begins to fit inside it. When one explanation becomes too powerful, others can start to look superficial, pre-scientific, not the real reason. A paper cat becomes an autistic person who thinks he is a paper cat. So, is diagnosis the problem? Is neurodiversity discourse the problem? Absolutely not. The real question might be, why do we need a public explanatory framework in order to be intelligible in the first place? Maybe it's because we live in a world where our differences become problems that demand explanation. In that world, the need for diagnosis, community, and a shared language is completely real and understandable. However, if we can live in a world where you can understand yourself through neurodiversity or not, and just be a paper cat, and neither choice makes your life harder, wouldn't that be nice?